think every year this is a category that doesn't really get talked about enough. My reactions to these films were probably the most visceral out of any films that I watched in the past year, including the films that I watched for Best Picture. Let's talk about The Zone of Interest, directed by Jonathan Glazer, which is probably many people's frontrunner for this year's Best International Film, just because it also got nominated for Best Picture. It follows a family that lives on the outskirts of Auschwitz during the height of the Holocaust, where the father of the family is one of Hitler's foremost officers. I mean, this film was made to conjure a reaction out of you. My friend Alan told me about how they took Sony Venice's, and apparently you can, with that camera, you can disconnect some part of the camera from the body so that you can station lenses around different parts of the house, which is what Glazer did.
So everything you're going to see in this scene was shot simultaneously with 10 cameras.
He'd have these hidden cameras hidden in different corners of different rooms, but the main body of the camera would be outside with the crew. The cast was literally just living the lives of this German family. The commitment to the medium of filmmaking goes beyond that as well. There's some moments the camera turns into a thermal camera. It turns black and white, or when we suddenly start following a young Jewish girl. The score and the soundtrack are incredibly minimal, and yet it really entangles with your physical senses, and there's a commitment to that.
Using all these cameras simultaneously was because I really didn't want to have this sort of the artificial construction of a conventional film.
The thing is that I have a lot of negative things to say about this film. There isn't any plot. The characters aren't really going anywhere. There's not a lot of dialogue that keeps you entertained. I think that cinema that is boring for the sake of being boring, for the sake of creating the reaction that is just discussed when there is something boring in front of you that you can't really escape, I'm not really sure that taking advantage of that feeling is necessarily a success in my eyes. It felt like the academic jargon of creating this meta commentary around this film got in the way of actually creating anything meaningful. But I think that there is value to talking about a film in a way where you can separate the experience, which for me was utter disgust and boredom, with the actual takeaway of the film. I think that it's an incredibly important subject matter, and the people who have said that it's incredibly relevant now, I completely agree with them. And I'm very curious if it will actually win Best International Film. But the funniest thing about The Zone of Interest being the frontrunner for this category this year is the existence of two of its co-nominees, Io Capitano and The Society of the Snow. Io Capitano follows two Senegalese boys who choose to run away from their home countries to essentially start a new life in Europe. But as soon as they leave Senegal, they find out pretty quickly how brutal the world can be to boys in their situation. The film showcases both human exploitation and human trafficking, and the depiction of their suffering, as well as many other characters in the film, is very brutally vivid on screen. The Society of the Snow is about a Uruguayan rugby team who got on a plane to Chile, and their plane crashed in the middle of the Andes Mountains. What they have to do to survive the many days that they were stuck there without any help or any food or any water is pretty grim to watch. The humor that I'm referencing obviously is not within the subject matter of these films themselves, but rather the fact that they've been placed next to The Zone of Interest. One film is supposedly criticizing the exact act that two of them are literally using for the sake of dramatic success. In a way, they both rely on images of human suffering to create an impression on you as a viewer, in order for you to care about the characters, in order to create stakes. And in a way, I have to honestly be like, you know what, Jonathan Glazer, you might just have a fucking point. I want to start with The Society of the Snow. The problem with it is that the storytelling feels so formulaic and to the point that it almost becomes reductive in the way that it tells its story. A specific example of this is the monologue that opens the film. The opening monologue proceeds to tell you exactly what the takeaway of the film is supposed to be, what the purpose of the film and its representation of these boys are supposed to represent.
Unos dicen que fue una tragedia, otros hablan de un milagro. ¿Qué pasó realmente? ¿Qué pasa cuando el mundo te abandona? Cuando no tenés ropa, te estás congelando. Cuando no tenés comida y te estás muriendo.
Already, they're preempting you as the audience to think about the things that they want you to think about. There's no openness, and there's a lack of trust in the audience. It's a recurring monologue that comes back over and over to essentially remind you of what the film is about. I think that this storytelling crutch that became so prevalent within the film was incredibly distracting.
Vos tenés las mejores piernas del equipo. Tenés que caminar por los demás.
I felt like over and over during this 2.5 hours, I was just watching the same thing happen on screen, without reaching anything deeper that the film itself could actually offer. It's disappointing considering how unique the story is, and how much more daring they could have been with how gruesome the subject matter is. With Io Capitano is less of a basic structural flaw. and more so hidden within the substance of the film itself. I feel like there's been many times where my friends and I will talk about how non-English speaking films will often get away with dialogue that is much more poetic, just because we, as a English speaking audience, are consuming it via reading the words on a screen, rather than actually internalizing the tone of voice and the inflections, all of which are so key to the way that we normally communicate verbally. But even as I read the subtitles in Io Capitano, something felt off. It felt like the performances were being pushed just a little bit too far forward in terms of the emotion. It felt like none of the decisions that the characters were making any sense, and the way that they were justifying them in the conversations felt a little bit too straightforward.
Jamais tu conduis le bateau, et t'emmènes toi et ton ami.
Mais moi, j'ai jamais conduit un bateau.
It felt like the ways that they were even betraying each other, in the way that the sons betray their mothers to run away.
Xel mi kan moo ko ci def. Gis nga fii ma nekk fi laa bëgg nga nekk fi ñu bokk li ñuy nooyi ma ak yow.
It just felt so formulaic, the way that sons would have betrayed their mothers, for the reasons that these kids would have wanted to run away, to become pop stars in Europe, with the ideas that they got from watching TikTok on their phones.
Tuuti nga nekk stade bu mag too bu xonk cur bu xonkul doo ko signal bu xonk cur ngay signal autographe boy.
It almost felt too streamlined, and all of a sudden, boom, they already left. There's so little time spent in making this decision that is going to change the rest of their entire lives. They're running away not just from their mothers, but their siblings and everything that they've ever known. And all of that happens within the first 30 minutes of the film, as if the consideration of that part of the film just wasn't fully bred into the story. Why is it that even when they run into some of the most gruesome and horrifying obstacles a human being can run into as they're trying to live their life, they somehow find their way out of each one, as if there is a convenience to watching them get out of something and back into something, get out of something, get back into something, as if we're getting roped along into something that is trying to say something about these events, as opposed to genuinely demonstrating what these events can do to a person. In fact, it's a bit too convenient. Convenient in the sense that you are telling a half-assed immigrant story that adds practically nothing new to stories of the African diaspora, or any diaspora for that matter, just so that you can reap the rewards of a society that considers stories like this important in this day and age. Recently, one of my friends, Malachi, talked about his experience writing a new screenplay. Something that he's worried about as he writes this autobiographical narrative is that he's worried that people, when they end up consuming the story, will associate parts of him that he made up within this film as genuine parts of him. Will the audience mistake flaws in the characters and the story for something that is genuinely a part of the person who wrote it, just because of so much of the context that surrounds them is that way? I can't think of a film that lacks more of that vulnerability than this one. And in fact, that's probably why the story feels so straightforward and streamlined, as opposed to something that's actually raw and expressive. I want to be honest with you, the thing that I want to say most about Io Capitano is, how can you expect a film with characters that look like this be successful when the person who made it looks like this? Of course there's going to be a problem with authenticity. There's obviously going to be a disconnect in terms of what the characters of the film understand about their experience and what the director understands about his own character's experiences. Perfect Days is a film directed by Wim Wenders, and he directed this film in a way that blew my mind. Set in modern-day Tokyo with an entirely Japanese cast, except Wim Wenders is a fucking German dude. Perfect Days is about an elderly Japanese man, Hirayama, played by Koji Yakusho, and it's about his life and career as a public toilet cleaner. You see, the way that the film is structured is unlike any other that I've ever seen. You spend multiple days in a row watching him wake up, clean toilets, then go to bed. And this happens over and over and over with the same routine and a slight difference in the people that he meets every single day. These slight differences are what color this film in a way that allows you to learn about his friends, his family, and his thoughts about his life in general. And in doing so, it touches on the question of what we as society value as the purpose of life, and where we get happiness from. And after all, isn't that the most universal and most important question a film can even pose to us in the first place? What I think Perfect Day succeeds at most of all is the fact that it never assumes that what it's trying to say or what it's telling is the truth. In fact, it even goes as far as to doubt the claims that it makes throughout the film. What has become apparent to me about the films that I've genuinely enjoyed this year is that the best films of this year have allowed themselves to embrace the fact that they don't really know the difference between right and wrong. For some reason, there's something about that quality of embracing the fact that you don't really fucking know if you're doing the right thing or if you're telling the right message, but just that this story is one that's worth telling. There's something about a devotion to a story, even without knowing what kind of moral message you're sending, that really touches on a core aspect of being a human being in our society at this moment. The Teacher's Lounge, which is Germany's submission for Best International Film, follows a young woman who attempts to go above and beyond at one of the hardest jobs that you could probably ever take on as a human being, which is that of an elementary school teacher. She leads with an empathy-first mindset, which means that she tries and circumvents a lot of the built-in rules and regulations of the institution that she works in, as well as just the general institution of education that we know. The story starts to accelerate when she discovers one of the other workers at the school stealing from her, or at least she thinks she does. There's an accusation thrown. Now, everything starts to become even more chaotic when you realize that the school worker, her son, is in this teacher's class. The thing is I'm a sucker for films that are about children and the way that we bring them up. I think that it's an incredibly important subject for films that doesn't really get explored as much as it probably could be, just because of the way that it's difficult to get child actors to give performances in the same way that adult performers can. But with The Teacher's Lounge, I genuinely felt myself consumed by the subject matter to the point where it felt like my entire attention span was just locked into the film. The thing about Perfect Days is that even though when I went and saw Perfect Days, I thought that I had finally watched the best international feature film without a doubt, there were times where it felt like it wasn't totally occupying every inch of my attention. I mean, it's a meditative film. You're constantly thinking about ways that Wenders decided to portray this man's life. Perfect Days is a film that engages with something very, very familiar, but does it in a way that's very new. Whereas The Teacher's Lounge is dealing with something that we probably don't really think about enough, but it's using a form that we've seen many times. And in doing so, that combination also creates something new. I think that this head-to-head in this category is such a wonderful battle of form and style and subject matter and storytelling. Both of them are stories that are so beautifully told. I'm really excited to see the results of this category, and let's just say I hope the Academy doesn't fuck it all up.
今は今
Avengers Endgame came out in the time before COVID. My friends and I packed ourselves into this tiny little theater by our school, and we went and watched it. Even with the abysmal garbage that they're putting out now, I'll always be able to thank Marvel for the fucking bangers that they put out during my teenage years. For a while, I thought that that was all in the past. And then, last summer, I saw this. Spiderman Across the Spider-Verse was one of the most incredible adventures a film has ever taken me on. In the next 5 seconds, I'm going to spoil big parts of this film, so if you haven't seen it already, please just go and watch it. When they revealed that Miles had gone back to the wrong dimension, it felt like I was watching Thor stab Thanos in the chest again, just to watch Thanos still snap his fingers anyways. All I'm saying is that if we get the equivalent of an I Am Iron Man moment in part 3, then this trilogy might just be the best superhero trilogy ever made, and I'm talking about it beating something like The Dark Knight. A big part of this is because I think it's incredibly difficult to make a story that gets incredibly meta about the art of storytelling itself, while maintaining such a high level of immersion and entertainment. The script was brilliant, the animation was incredible, and even though this soundtrack didn't have the equivalent to Sunflower in terms of its scope and international success as a pop hit, I honestly thought that this soundtrack by Metro Boomin was superior. It was just a fantastic all-around film. And what's crazy is that I'm not sure if that is the best animated film of the year. I want to preface my discussion of Studio Ghibli and Hayao Miyazaki's film, The Boy and the Heron, by saying that when I grew up, I didn't really watch a ton of Studio Ghibli films. I wasn't one of the people who has been familiar with his work throughout my entire life. I mean, I feel like at some point I did watch Spirited Away. I feel like at some point I did watch Howl's Moving Castle, but if you showed me stills of those two films side by side nowadays, I'm not totally sure I could tell you which one's from which. You're probably expecting me to start yapping about how incredible The Boy and the Heron was, from one of the greatest animators to ever step foot into the cinema landscape. But when I watched it for the first time, I was actually struggling and fighting to stay awake. It's very slow. It's so slow that I went and saw it again and I fell asleep again for a longer period of time. But then I saw it for a third time, and this time was different. I went with a group of friends from home. Some of them have been some of my oldest friends that I've had in my entire life. I've known them since 2nd grade. And when we got to the theater, one of my friends who I have known since 2nd grade, his dad was sitting in the seats next to us, completely unplanned. The experience ended up being a bit surreal. While I was watching this movie, which is essentially just an old man experiencing his memories and his own imagination through his younger self again, I was sitting in a seat next to somebody who had coached me in recreational soccer at like the age of 8. And for some reason, the connection of these two things just kind of spoke with me. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that I was seeing it dubbed in English for the first time. The other two times were Japanese with English subtitles. And I was actually hearing the inflections and tones of their voices. I was actually seeing moments of the animation, of their facial expressions that usually I was looking down at the bottom of the screen for the white letters. There was something about those extra seconds that I got to look at the characters' actual faces that did actually make a difference. This third time watching The Boy and the Heron was an out-of-body experience, but part of it wasn't actually the content of the film itself. It was the fact that it felt like I could actually, because of the fact that I was watching it for a third time, understand what Miyazaki was trying to say in a way that I'm not really sure I get to that level with any of the films that I see on a regular basis. After reading more about Miyazaki and learning about what parts of his life were reflected in this film, I can honestly say that this felt genuinely like a reflection on his own life. I could actually feel the fact that this film was a representation of an old man looking back at his memories and not really having any way of really reconciling with them, except doing what he's always done, which is resort to his imagination and come up with a fantastical story. I really do think that the Academy has a tough choice here. I wouldn't be surprised if they gave it to The Boy and the Heron just as a way of honoring Miyazaki and what he's done for animation and for cinema as a whole, especially since the Spider-Man team is cooking up another banger, hopefully. Unfortunately, the other three films in this category are pretty disappointing. Robot Dreams is a cute little story about a dog living in an animal world that's for some reason set in 1980s New York. He gets a robot companion because of his loneliness. Their separation creates anxiety that leads to dreams about each other. It's very cute, it's well animated, but the whole thing is devoid of dialogue and it moves relatively slowly without any real payoff. Elemental is one of the biggest disappointments that we've probably seen from Pixar so far.
This shop is dream of our family. Someday it'll all be yours.
It's a cheap commodification of an immigrant story told through the anthropomorphism of elements that is not only poorly written, but lazily animated.
I don't feel I lost in my dream.
It also just generally struggles to balance the nuance of creating fictional characters in a movie for children, as well as the racial dynamics that it's hinting at that are pretty obvious how it relates to real life. I think when your metaphor about an interracial couple is fire and water and how these two elements are fundamentally incompatible, you're getting a little too excited about racial division. I mean, children's story or not, I think that this is just a bit reductive. And finally, Nimona is incredibly bland. I do understand that the queer representation in this film is something to be excited about, but I also think it feels kind of corporate. I think that the biggest giveaway is that despite the queer representation, let's just do yourself a favor and search up the writers and the directors on IMDb. Just have a look at what they as people seem to be. And think about what representation in a film really ought to be. Is it about drawing certain people, or is it about introducing people into positions of storytelling power in the industry? That's all I'm going to say.